friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last week we got to know a little bit more about who Arne Saknussemm was, and a little bit more about the island of Iceland during this time. But tonight we get to meet a very important character of this story, Hans. And I'll let the chapter explain him to yourself, but he's going to be a major part of this story from now on. Plus, you get to answer the question is, if you're going to be journeying to the center of the earth, what do you bring? This chapter will tell you. So join me for chapter 11 as we meet Hans, learn about what to bring on a long camping trip, and watch me fumble over some foreign names. I tried my best. Enjoy. Chapter 11. Our Guide Hans. In the evening, I went for a short walk on the beach, returning early to go to bed on my plank bed, where I slept soundly all night. When I awoke, I heard my uncle talking volubly in the next room. I got up straight away and quickly joined him. He was chatting in Danish with a big, strapping fellow who was obviously uncommonly strong. His eyes, set in a large, ingenuous face, were a dreamy blue and struck me as very intelligent. Long hair, which would have been called red even in England, fell over his athletic shoulders. This Icelander was supple in his movements, but he did not move his arms very much, like a man who knew or cared nothing of the language of gestures. Everything about him indicated a perfectly calm temperament, not indolent, but peaceful. You could see at a glance that he asked nothing of anybody, that he worked as it suited him, and that nothing in this world could astonish or disturb his philosophy of life. I gathered more about his character from the way in which he listened to the professor's excited verbiage. He stood there with his arms folded, motionless in the face of my uncle's wild gesticulations. To express the negative, his head turned from left to right. For the affirmative, it bent forward, that it so slightly that his long hair barely moved. He carried economy of movement to the point of avarice. Certainly I should never have guessed from looking at this man that he was a hunter. Admittedly, he would not frighten the game, but how could he ever get near it? This mystery was explained when Mr. Fridriksson told me that this calm person only hunted the eider, a bird whose plumage constitutes the chief wealth of the island. This plumage is known, in fact, as eiderdown, and no great expenditure of movement is required to obtain it. In early summer, the female, a sort of pretty duck, goes and builds her nest among the rocks of the fjords with which the coast is fringed. After building this nest, she lines it with fine feathers, of which she plucks from her belly. Then the hunter, or rather the trader, arrives and takes the nest, and the female starts her work all over again. This goes on as long as she has any down left. When she has stripped herself bare, the male takes his turn to pluck himself. But as his feathers are hard and coarse and have no commercial value, the hunter does not bother to take his nest. The female accordingly lays her eggs, the young hatch out, and the next year the harvesting of the eiderdown begins again. Now, as the eider does not pick steep cliffs on which to build her nest, but rather these smooth, terraced rocks which slope into the sea, the Icelandic hunter can pursue his occupation without undue exertion. He is a farmer who has no need to sow or cut his harvest, but simply has to gather it in. This grave, phlegmatic, silent individual was called Hans Bjelke, and he came recommended by Mr. Fridriksson. He was to be our guide. His ways formed a great contrast with my uncle's, but they got on very well together. Neither of them worried about terms. The one was ready to accept what he was offered, the other to offer what he was asked. Never was a bargain more easily concluded. Under this agreement, Hans undertook to guide us to the village of Stapi, on the south shore of the Sneffels Peninsula, at the very foot of the volcano. The distance by land was about 22 miles, which my uncle reckoned we could cover in 2 days. But when he discovered that the Danish mile was 8,000 yards long, he was obliged to revise his calculations and allow 7 or 8 days for the journey. We were to have 4 horses, 1 each for my uncle and myself, and 2 for our luggage. Hans, as was his custom, was to go on foot. He knew that part of the coast perfectly, and he promised to take us the shortest way. His engagement with my uncle did not come to an end with our arrival at Stapi. He was to continue in his service for the whole period of his scientific researches, in return for 3 rix dollars a week. But it was expressly stipulated that this sum should be paid to the guide every Saturday evening, a condition which he regarded as a sine qua non of the engagement. The start was fixed for 16th of June. My uncle wanted to pay the hunter a sum in advance, but he refused with a single word. "Ifter," he said. "After," said the professor for my edification. Once the agreement had been concluded, Hans promptly withdrew. "A splendid fellow!" exclaimed my uncle, "but he little knows what a wonderful part he is going to play in the future." "So he's coming with us to—" "Yes, Axel, to the center of the earth." 48 hours remained until our departure. To my great regret, I had to spend them on our preparations. All our ingenuity was devoted to packing every article to the best advantage. Instruments here, arms there, tools in this package, provisions in that, 4 sets of parcels in all. The instruments consisted of 1. An Eigel centigrade thermometer, reading up to 150 degrees, which seemed to me either too high or too low. Too high if the temperature of the air was to rise so far, for in that case we should be baked to death. Too low if it was to take the temperature of hot springs or other melted matter. 2. A manometer of compressed air to indicate pressures higher than that of the atmosphere at sea level. An ordinary barometer would not have answered the purpose, as the atmospheric pressure would increase in proportion to the depth of our descent underground. Number 3, a chronometer made by the younger Boissonnas of Geneva and set to the meridian of Hamburg. 4, 2 compasses, one for inclination, the other for declination. 5, a night glass. 6, 2 Ruhmkorff coils, which, by means of an electric current, provided a safe, handy, and portable light. The arms consisted of 2 rifles made by Purdley Moore and Company and 2 Colt revolvers. Why were we taking arms? We had no need to fear savages or wild beasts, or so at least I supposed. But my uncle seemed to be just as attached to his arsenal as he was to his instruments, and particularly to a large quantity of gun cotton, which is unaffected by damp and has a greater explosive force than ordinary gunpowder. The tools consisted of 2 mattocks, 2 pickaxes, a silk rope ladder, 3 iron-shod staves, an axe, a hammer, a dozen iron wedges and spikes, and some long knotted cords. All this made a big package, for the ladder was 300 feet long. Lastly, there were the provisions. Not a big package, but one that I found reassuring, for I knew that it contained enough meat extract and biscuits to last us 6 months. Gin was the only liquid, and there was no water at all, but we had some flasks, and my uncle counted on finding springs from which we could fill them. The fears I had expressed as to the quality and temperature of these springs, and indeed as to their existence, had gone totally disregarded. To complete the exact inventory of our traveling accessories, I ought to add that we had a medicine chest containing blunt scissors, splints for fractures, a piece of tape of unbleached linen, bandages and compresses, lint, and a basin for bleeding, all rather terrifying objects, as well as a set of bottles of dextrine, medical alcohol, liquid acetate of lead, ether, vinegar, and ammonia, drugs which did nothing to reassure me. Finally, we had all the necessary chemicals for the Ruhmkorff lamps. My uncle had been careful not to forget tobacco, gunpowder, and touchwood, nor a leather belt which he wore next to his skin and which contained a goodly sum of gold, silver, and notes. 6 pairs of stout boots, waterproofed with a mixture of tar and India rubber, were packed with the tools. "Clothed, shod, and equipped like this," said my uncle, "there's no reason why we shouldn't go a very long way." The whole of the 14th was spent packing all these various articles. In the evening we dined with Baron Trampa, in company with the mayor of Reykjavik and Dr. Hjaltalin, the leading medical man in the place. Mr. Fredrickson was not there. I later learned that he and the governor were at loggerheads over some administrative question and avoided meeting each other. I was therefore unable to understand a single word that was spoken in the course of this semi-official dinner. I only noticed that my uncle talked all the time. The next day, the 15th, we completed our preparations. Our host delighted the professor by presenting him with a map of Iceland, infinitely superior to that of Henderson. It was a map made by Mr. Olaf Nicholas Olsen, on a scale of 1 to 480,000, on the basis of geological studies by Mr. Scheel Frisak, and a topographical survey by Mr. Bjorn Gumlavsson. Published by the Icelandic Literary Society, it was a precious document for a mineralogist. Our last evening was spent in friendly conversation with Mr. Fredrickson, to whom I had taken a great liking. The talk was followed, in my case at least, by a restless night. At 5 in the morning, the neighing of our 4 horses pawing the ground under my window woke me. I dressed quickly and went down into the street. There, Hans was holding the last of our luggage, almost without moving a limb, but with remarkable skill. My uncle was giving more advice than help, and the guide seemed to be paying very little attention to his instructions. At 6 o'clock, everything was ready. Mr. Fredrickson shook hands with us. My uncle thanked him warmly in Icelandic for his kind hospitality. For my part, I elaborated a cordial farewell in my best Latin. Then we mounted our horses, and with his final farewell, Mr. Fredrickson called out to me a line of Virgil, which seemed eminently applicable to the uncertain travelers that we were. And that's the end of chapter 11. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories, but until then, be well and sleep well.